Hi, it's Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. Thank you for joining us as we continue our study in the Gospel of Mark. Today we're in Mark chapter 8. We're going to be looking at an event that is shockingly similar to one that had occurred before. It seems as though this may be déjà vu all over again. I'm talking about the feeding of many thousands. This time it's 4,000. In Mark 6, verses 30 through 44, we had seen Jesus feed 5,000. But lest anyone think that these are the same event, we should note that there are notable differences between Jesus' feeding of the 4,000 and his feeding of the 5,000. These are some of the notable differences, most of all the difference in location. The feeding of the 5,000 took place near Bethsaida, Luke tells us, and what we're going to read in just a few moments takes place at the Decapolis on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. There's a difference in how many people were fed. 5,000 men plus women and children, and today 4,000 men plus women and children. There's a difference in the quantity of food that was at first available, 5 loaves and 2 fishes in Mark 6, verse 38. Here we'll read about 7 loaves and a few fish, an undetermined amount, in chapter 8. There were 12 baskets left over at the beginning. This time there'll be 7 baskets left over. Back in Mark, in Matthew's account of the feeding of the 5,000, he notes that the crowds were with him for a day. Here Jesus is going to say that the crowds have been with him for 3 days. During the feeding of the 5,000, when he was done, he sent the disciples away. We'll see him depart with the disciples in this account. So let's go ahead and read first of all about Jesus' compassion for the people. What is it that drove him to do this miracle in the first place? In Mark chapter 8, in verse 1, it says, "In those days there was again a large crowd, and they had nothing to eat. And Jesus called his disciples and said to them, I feel compassion for the people, because they have remained with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they'll faint on the way, and some of them have come from a great distance." And we'll stop there for now. Several times, Mark reminds us of the emotions of Jesus. And at least 3 times in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew reminds us of the compassion of Christ in chapters 9 and chapter 14. But this is the first time where Jesus himself announces it. He declares it in verse 2. I feel compassion for the people, he says. And it's a good time to remind ourselves of the nature of the Lord, why he even came in the first place. It was because of compassion. When Jesus looked upon the people, we're told in Matthew's gospel, he looked upon them as those who were like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus is looking upon these people who have a very real need, and it evokes a deep feeling of wanting to do something to help them, to better them. And of course, Jesus is just the guy to do it. So they consider what it is that they have available. In verse 4, his disciples answered him, where will anyone be able to find enough bread here in this desolate place to satisfy these people? And he was asking them, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. Later on, we'll see that they also have a few small fish in verse 7. So it seems that the disciples' reply to Jesus is a little surprising, considering all that they have already seen him do. I mean, the very same thing, almost the identical incident had popped up sometime before, and they had seen Jesus literally multiply bread and fish in order to feed a large hungry multitude. However long ago that was, it seems that they'd already, forgotten about it, or maybe they thought that Jesus would do something different here in order to impart a fresh lesson maybe to the crowd. Whatever the reason for the disciples' obtuseness, at least it seems to us incredible. That is, until we start to maybe examine ourselves a little bit more. How often do we fail to see something that has been made obvious to us before concerning the Lord? One fellow put it this way. He said, some of us are too conscious of similar unbelief in ourselves, in spite of repeated instances of grace, to wonder long at the blindness of the apostles. Well, that's an eye-opener for sure. So what Jesus does is he considers the resources, and then he does what he always does. He provides for the people. In verse 6, he directed the people to sit down on the ground, and taking the 7 loaves, he gave thanks and broke them, started giving them to his disciples to serve to them, and they served them to the people. They also had a few small fish, and after he had blessed them, he ordered these to be served as well. And they ate and were satisfied. And they picked up 7 large baskets full of what was left over of the broken pieces. About 4,000 were there, and he sent them away. And immediately he entered the boat with his disciples and came to the district of Dalmanutha. Now, as before, in the previous instance in Mark chapter 6, Jesus give thanks. And of course, it's a reminder to us that we should be thankful for the food that God gave to us. But there's something going on here that I think is important. Where it says that Jesus gave thanks, the verb tense is present. In other words, it means that this is a continual thing. Jesus always gave thanks. Jesus had always gave thanks before. He's giving thanks now, and he's going to continue to give thanks. And it says that the people ate and were satisfied. The word for satisfied means literally fulfilled. In fact, they couldn't eat any more. They had 7 baskets of leftovers that were taken up, and so now that the people have eaten and have been rejuvenated and are fit for traveling, Jesus sends them away. But we should note that although this is a different instance, there are some things that remain the same. For one thing, Jesus still has compassion for people. And we should also note that the disciples here still don't get it. Now, Jesus is going to address that in very strong terms in just a bit. Jesus still used, though, what was available. Before it was 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now it's a different amount. And when Jesus worked, there was still plenty that was left over. Well, Jesus isn't done dealing with difficult people, because right at that moment, some Pharisees come to ask if Jesus would do a trick for them. Now, it seems that unbelief comes in different forms. The Pharisees and the disciples were both united in hard-heartedness, although for different reasons. The Pharisees were willfully stubborn. They demanded astronomical signs from the Lord. The disciples are merely slow learners. They're getting it. They're still struggling, but they're still in the same boat with Jesus. They're thinking earthly things, and Jesus is seeking to get them to overcome the earthly, as he's about to warn them of the potential impact that the Pharisees could have on them. And sometimes it seems like that's maybe the problem with us from time to time. We're more concerned about the earthly bread than we are about the spiritual leaven that can grow in our own hearts. Well, let's see what goes on between Jesus and these sign seekers. First of all, notice their request in verse 11. It says, the Pharisees came out and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. So they're seeking from him a sign from heaven. The words "a sign from heaven" refers to a miracle. That's what they want to see. They want to see some authentication from God himself that Jesus is doing what he ought to do, as supposedly in their minds, maybe thinking he's somebody sent from God. Of course, they don't believe that for a minute. So they want some proof. Show us a sign from heaven, they say. But notice why it says they do this. Their real motive is easy for us to see. To test him. to argue with him, it tells us there in verse 11. There have already been credible reports of what Jesus has done. He's already raised the dead at least once. Jesus has healed multitudes of unhealable people. He has touched the untouchable. There is proof galore, and yet they still seek for another sign. Well, Jesus, instead of giving them a sign, gives them a rebuke. In verse 12, it says that he sighed deeply in his spirit, and he said, "Why does this generation seek for a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation." As he did when dealing with the deaf man earlier in Mark chapter 7, Jesus sighs. He groans inwardly and deeply. Obviously, he's troubled and frustrated by the Jews' obstinance and hard-heartedness, and he displays an utterly human emotion, one that is also shared with his Father. There's disappointment and displeasure that is an indication of God's great love and concern for man. Exodus chapter 34 tells us about it. Ezekiel chapter 2 tells us about it. And now Jesus shows us. Jesus begins his spoken rebuke with a question. Why does this generation seek for a sign? Later in his parable of the wicked vine growers in Mark chapter 12, Jesus will drive home the fact that although God had sent various men throughout their history to exhort them to return to him, they stubbornly refused to believe in them. So this generation is a result of all previous generations. And Jesus said, "You've had enough. You don't deserve a sign." Look what he says at the end of verse 12. "Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." Jesus, it seems as though he's fed up with these people and their obstinance. He would rather, I'm sure, devote his time to those who were willing to listen, to those who have already believed by what he's already done. And his answer clearly shows their failure to see spiritually. 2 Corinthians 5 verse 7 says that we walk by faith and not by sight, but these guys are all about sight. They're all about what they can see, feel, and touch. They're all about some kind of proof that even though Jesus were to give it to them, even if he were to say, "Okay, here's a sign for you," and poof, he did something, do you think for a moment that they would have believed it? No, they're not. Their motives are unclean. Their motives are impure. They have absolutely no intention of giving Jesus any kind of credence whatsoever. And Jesus knows this. And he knows also how powerful their reach might be. So he reminds his disciples about the great difference between bread and leaven. As Jesus continues, verse 13 says that leaving them, he again embarked and went away to the other side. Jesus is always getting in a boat going somewhere in Mark's gospel. But Jesus gives his disciples a warning in verses 14 and 15. It says that they had forgotten to take bread and did not have more than one loaf in the boat with them. And he was giving orders to them, saying, "Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." Now, both Gospels of Matthew and Mark note that the disciples had forgotten to take bread along with them on their trip, but Mark adds the detail that they had one loaf. There was one loaf there. Who knows if this was left over from the recent 2 feedings of the 4, and before that the 5,000. After all, we don't know how long it had been between these, or how much time had elapsed from the time that the Pharisees came to argue and test Jesus since the feeding of the 4,000. But Jesus tells them that they need to beware. He gives them a warning. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. Beware of the leaven of Herod. Now, leaven is being used by Jesus, of course, as a metaphor. He's not talking about, don't let them bake any bread for you. What he's talking about is something far more insidious. He's using this as a dark metaphor. Leaven is usually used in a negative sense in the New Testament. Paul's use of leaven in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 6, a little leaven leavens the whole lump, of course, is used to refer to the impact and the influence of sexual immorality that was apparently well known in the Corinthian church. Jesus uses leaven in the kingdom parables, but seems to use it in a positive sense there in Matthew chapter 13. But they seem to be exceptions. Usually leaven is used in a negative sense in the Bible. In his famous fourfold gospel, J.W. McGarvey says, leaven, which answers to our modern yeast, was a symbol of a secret, penetrating, pervasive influence, usually of a corrupting nature. The influence of the Pharisees was that of formalism, hypocritical ostentation, and traditionalism. That of the Sadducees was sneering, rationalistic unbelief, free thought, and cunning worldliness, manifesting itself among the Herodians in political corruption. Well, Brother J.W. McGarvey saw something certainly that the disciples here are completely misunderstanding, and they let Jesus know that they don't get it. In verse 16, says they began to discuss with one another the fact that they had no bread. They thought that that's what Jesus is referring to. Oh, do you think maybe we should have got some bread from the Herodians or from the Pharisees? Is it because we don't have any bread that Jesus is saying this thing? Immediately their minds go to worldly reasons for Jesus' remarks, and maybe it's a all too apt real-life illustration of what Jesus warned of in his parable of the sower and the seed in Matthew chapter 13, where sometimes the cares of temporal things, the concern for worldly things can choke out the spiritual word. Mark's commentary rings true of the disciples' slowness to learn what Jesus desires so much to teach them. Well, Jesus isn't going to let it go. He corrects the misunderstanding. In verse 17, Jesus, it says, aware of this, said to them, why do you discuss the fact that we have no bread? Do you not see or yet understand? Do you have a hardened heart? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves of the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces you picked up? They said to him, 12. And when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up? They said to him, 7. And he was saying to them, do you not yet understand? Jesus rebukes them for their lack of faith, which of course comes on the heels of a long line of rebukes from God himself to his people for their lack of faith. And as he admonishes them, he reminds them of the previous miracles, not just the one that he had done with the 4,000, but the previous one with feeding the 5,000. Their little faith stemmed from a lack of thoughtfulness. That Jesus wasn't talking about physical bread. He could have easily have supplied some now. If he was talking about bread, he could have made that one loaf that they did have into one loaf for each person or even more. How quickly they'd forgotten what Jesus had done. How quickly they forgot that what he intended to teach them was spiritual and not physical, not worldly. I've made a list of all the times that I can find in where Mark notes the thickness of the apostles. And we're not going to look at any of these, but this is just a reminder of the many times that Mark points out to us how thick-headed these disciples can be. How sad it is that they can be that way. Well, Jesus isn't done doing good for people. We're going to continue on in Mark chapter 8, where we see Jesus healing a man in a unique way, in that he heals the man in 2 steps. Now, Mark has already demonstrated that Jesus could heal simply with a spoken word. He didn't have to touch anyone. And so it's not as though blindness, which Jesus is about to heal, has suddenly become too powerful a thing for Jesus to deal with. No, I think there's a deeper meaning here. In doing it the way Jesus does, with 2 touches, especially coming right on the heels of the misunderstanding of the disciples, I think it means that these disciples were themselves seeing things in a blurry way, as this blind man will in just a moment. And although they're further along than they were at first, they're still not where they need to be. They're still not seeing clearly. And this miracle offers hope, I think, that Jesus can not only take people from being blind to blurry, but also from blurry to seeing clearly. So let's talk about this man. First, let's see that he's brought to Jesus in verse 22. It says, they came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to Jesus and implored him to touch him. Now, the man is brought to Jesus, apparently by those who loved him, who begged Jesus. They implore him. Might have a version that says they entreated him. It means to beseech. They were begging Jesus to do something with him, to touch him, to heal him. And indicates that in Bethsaida, in spite of the fact that Jesus had already rebuked Bethsaida for their lack of faith and belief in him, there were some people who seemed to believe in the healing power of Jesus' touch. And so Jesus does just that. He touches him and heals him. In verse 23, it says, taking the blind man by the hand, he brought him out of the village. And after spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on him, he asked him, do you see anything? And he looked up and said, I see men, for I see them like trees walking around. Then again he laid his hands on his eyes, and he looked intently, and was restored, and began to see everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, do not even enter the village. Now, Jesus leads him out of the village for some unknown reason. It's not told to us. And he applies spittle to his eyes. He spits on his eyes. One commentator said, Jesus used methods that the man could understand. Back then, spittle was thought to have healing properties. And it's not that Jesus is falling for any of the beliefs or the old wives' tales of the time. Rather, he's doing something that the man can understand. I mean, after all, it's Jesus' eye, or rather the man's eyes that need healing. Jesus deals with people in a way that they could grasp and understand. Notice the symbolism in this healing. He lays his hands on the man twice in order to fully heal him. And apparently this man wasn't born blind, since he knew what men and trees ought to look like, and that they were supposed to look differently. But notice again how it occurs in stages. And again, it's frequency to the episode that we had just left, where Jesus rebukes his disciples for not seeing clearly. Back in verse 18, Jesus asks them, having eyes, do you not see? Notice the symbolism and how it can be applied even to us. Men perish because we're blinded. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 3 and 4, it tells us that Satan has blinded the eyes of the unbelieving. And sometimes that can be us. But God's word was given to men gradually for a while, and then finally, when the Holy Spirit led his disciples into all the truth, and Paul says that when we read what he wrote, we can understand his insight. It was given to us so that we can finally and fully see his will. In fact, Peter tells us in 2 Peter 1 that we have everything that pertains to life and godliness through the true knowledge of him who called us by his will. And we can know everything that he wants us to. Now, we may be slow at the beginning, but more and more and more, our eyes can be opened to see clearly what he wants us to see. When Jesus is done with this fellow, I love what verse 25 says. It says that the man looked intently and was restored. I can just imagine a man being able to see for the first time in who knows how long, but he's able to see now, and he's able to look everywhere. And I'm sure that he examined everything closely because he hadn't seen anything in so long. And now he gets to go back home. But Jesus says, don't do it yet. Don't even enter the village, Jesus says in verse 26. And so we might wonder why Jesus did that. Why he asked them not to go back into the village. There may be a couple of reasons for this. One is Bethsaida was a region where Jesus earlier upbraided because of their unwillingness to acknowledge the miracles that he had done there. That's in Matthew chapter 11. But also don't forget that the hostility from the religious leadership is increasing, and certainly there would have been some of that religious leadership in Bethsaida, and so Jesus may not have wanted them to quite know that he was there yet. So Jesus just simply tells him, don't even go into the village, don't tell anybody yet. But I wonder how long this man could have kept the news to himself. I want you to notice something. We have just completed a major passage in the Gospel of Mark in chapters 6 through 8. And I want you to notice, before we leave this lesson today, how Mark carefully orders his material in parallels for us. And earlier in this section, we saw the feeding of the 5,000. Now we see the feeding of the 4,000. We see Jesus crossing the lake from one side to the other, and again we see it here in chapter 8. We see this controversy with the Pharisees in chapter 7. Now we see another controversy with the Pharisees here in chapter 8. Jesus speaks to a Syrophoenician woman about the children's bread in chapter 7. And here he has a discussion with his disciples concerning the one loaf. You recall that. Back in chapter 7, Jesus heals a man who is deaf and mute, although it tells us he could speak with difficulty. Here he heals a blind man. There's lots of things going on, and there are lots of things going on between the Jews and the Gentiles. You recall back in the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus does that apparently in Bethsaida, a Jewish region, and there were 12 loaves taken up. Perhaps there's something that refers maybe to the 12 tribes of Israel. Here, in the feeding of the 4,000, in a predominantly Gentile area, Jesus takes up 7 baskets left over. 7 is a number for completeness, and maybe that has something to do with the completeness of Jesus' mission towards not only the Jews, but also the Gentiles, that they'll be included as well. Well, there's lots of things that we can do here. There are parallels. Jesus does things in Jewish territory, and he does the same kind of things, or has the same kind of experiences in Gentile territory. Jesus is bringing the two together. What a wonderful thing. Well, we've seen that Jesus has bread for the hungry, even as he warns of the leaven from the Pharisees. Oh, but the bread for the hungry that Jesus brings, there's plenty for all. Well, thanks for joining us as we looked at yet another wonderful passage from the book of Mark. And I hope you'll join us next time. Thanks. God bless you.